a young Jewish teacher is getting a reputation. He's wandered around, and he's still wandering around, in a group of villages in the north of a country called Israel, in an area that's called Galilee. One of the towns in this area, Galilee, is called Nazareth. And as it happens, that's where he was brought up. The story's in the 1st century, and the Jewish people gathered on the Sabbath, on a Saturday, at a gathering place or a synagogue. And there they would pray, and they would read their scriptures, and they would study together. Jesus, the young teacher we're talking about, was Jewish, and this was his habit. On one particular Sabbath, Jesus attends, as we're told was his habit, but also he's invited, or he chooses to speak. He chooses to take a turn reading out of their scriptures, and that happened from a scroll. That day he chose, or he was given, the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and he chose a chapter 61, and he chose to read words of hope. In fact, the whole of the book of Isaiah is in some ways an inspired message, or messages of hope for the Jewish people. Their own story was one that had its roots in slavery. They were slaves in the past, and then their story was that they were freed from slavery by their God, who then took them and gave them a task. He told them they were to be partners in what he was doing. They were to be a blessing, and he gave them a land, Israel, and they developed a kingdom, and actually they grew an empire. But then their story was that they forgot who they were made to be. Things went badly, and they ended up actually kicked out of their own land and in slavery to another empire. At the point of this young Jewish teacher wandering around in Jesus' time, in the 1st century, the story's got to the point where some of the Jewish people are sort of back in their land, but it's not really theirs. And now the Roman Empire is in charge, and the Jewish people are in many ways just as trapped or enslaved to the power, to the military might, to the seductive marketing and branding machine of the Roman Empire way of life. They may as well be slaves. But they had their messages of hope. They had their scriptures, their story. And as they met together, they would come back to them. Isaiah is a collection of these messages of hope, and in some ways is about a person, a figure who might be part of turning that around. The words that Jesus reads out then from Isaiah are actually words that Isaiah would have spoken about himself, saying he was inspired to bring a message of what God was about to do. That God would bring hope. That there would be, as Jesus says on this day, good news for the poor, good news for prisoners, good news for those who are blind, who maybe don't understand what's going on. This is a God, this is a story, their scriptures are about a God who hears the cry, particularly the cry of the poor, the oppressed, and those who need freedom. We're told in this particular occasion, Jesus finishes reading out these words, and then, well, he stood up while he spoke. That's what you did when you read the scriptures. Then he sat down, and that's what a teacher would do. That's what a Jewish teacher would do, to then interpret or explain, give a message about what's just been read. Luke, the storyteller, tells us everybody was staring at him. There was a lot of anticipation, expectation. And Jesus begins his message, his sermon, if you like, saying, today, this has been fulfilled in your hearing. Interesting. What does he mean? What is he claiming? That somehow this project, this hope they have about God sorting things out is already happened, is happening now? If we've wrestled with the Jesus story at all, if we've seen the beginning of Luke's story, we'll know that we have a sense of what Jesus means. That Jesus certainly believes that he is a big part of making this happen, of moving this project forward. That somehow his life, later his death and his resurrection, will be part of how God puts things back together. But those first listeners, hearing that read out in the synagogue, may not have thought like that. They were probably expecting that God would bring a new king, or a warrior, or a leader, or a priest, or a prophet, someone who would collect them together and get them back on track, or ideally raise an army and smash the Roman machine, maybe give them their own land and their own empire. We don't know what they were thinking, but we do know, Luke tells us, that they were impressed, at least up to this point. They say to themselves, look, isn't this Joseph's son? Here he is, he's now grown up, he's age 30, he's started to wander around teaching and healing people. And now listen to his fine words. But then the story starts to change. Because Jesus continues and he suggests something pretty negative. He said, oh, you'll say to me, physician, doctor, heal yourself. And that seems to come out of nowhere. Jesus isn't ill. What he's doing, we believe, is using a saying of the time. And what he seems to be getting at is an idea that seems to be collecting, that people believe, and we've heard this phrase before, that charity begins at home. In other words, what they are saying by this phrase, this saying is, look, you've been wandering around in different places like Capernaum, but what about your own family, your own friends, your own people? Surely you should be benefiting them first, and maybe them only. Jesus then goes further. He says, look, prophets are often taken for granted or even rejected where they're from. Sometimes I think that kind of thing might be just because it's hard to see somebody you've seen grow up in a new role. But I think there's more going on here. You see, if you read through the Jewish scripture, so many of their prophets were rejected by their own people. And it wasn't because they were over familiar with them, it's because people didn't like what they were saying. It was so uncomfortable. Jesus mentions two in particular, Elijah and Elisha. And this is not by accident. He's not just picking random prophets. And because he mentions two particular stories about two particular individuals. In one case he talks about a widow. In another case he talks about an army officer. And what did they have in common? Neither of them were part of the Jewish family, tribe, nation. They were outsiders. They were known as Gentiles. It just means non-Jews. The kind of people called, Jewish people would call the dogs. This seems to be where the crowd actually starts to get upset. Because perhaps they feel Jesus is accusing them of being really selfish, of self-centered, of just wanting him or God to look after them and their people like them. And you can understand why at their point in their story, in the situation they're in, what they want is God to get rid of their problems, the Romans and the empire, and then for God to put them in charge and to actually punish the Romans and give them some justice for all the things that they've done to them. This is about grudges. This is about vengeance. But as we'll see in Luke's story, this is not what the Jesus story is about. In the words that Jesus says, in the words that Luke uses about him, you'll notice that he says that the people were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. In the Greek, scholars will tell us that that phrase can mean, or really does have the sense of saying that his words were full of grace. Words about grace, not necessarily that they were just nice words. And what is grace about? Grace is about generosity, about forgiveness, about giving favour where there's nothing deserved, more than is deserved. Seems like maybe that kind of message, a message of grace, is not what they wanted to hear. They definitely wanted good news for themselves, for Nazareth, for Jewish people, for our families. But instead, someone's talking about good news for all the poor, for all the captives, for all the oppressed, for all their enemies, for all these outsiders, for all these non-Jews, people who we think are the them. No wonder some of them didn't like it. What Luke, who's collecting these stories together, will keep coming back to is that this is not new. It's not what they might have been expecting, but it's not new. It's always been the creation story. It's always been God's story. It's always been the Jewish story and the Jesus story all along, that God's love, God's plan, God's mercy, God's grace, God's movement is bigger than hardly anyone can imagine, and so often unexpected and challenging. This story is about all creation, all nations, the renewal of all things. Those are big phrases. This story, and indeed every story about Jesus, causes a reaction, a response. There's no middle ground. At the end of this one, the crowd turn from amazement and pride and wonder into a mob, some of them ready to take Jesus and kill him by pushing him off a cliff. But instead, somehow, he walks through the crowd and away. Whatever is happening, however it happened. What I wonder is if Luke is wanting us to know at the end of this incident that as much as there will be opposition to Jesus, as much as people might not understand or like what he says, nothing is going to stop Jesus. Nothing is going to stop this project. He is going, it says, his way. It may not be the way they expected or wanted, but it is God's way and it can't be stopped. And it demands a response, a reaction. And some will be uncomfortable and push back and oppose and try to attack, and others will celebrate and join in. I want to be the ones who join in.